Night falls over a perfect white mansion on a hill. Tourists take photos. The flags, the gift shop, the stories about the father of the nation. But this is the tragic story of Mount Vernon, George Washington's slave-built mansion. Because behind those bright rooms and green lawns once stood locked cabins, whips, chains, and people whose names most visitors never hear. Men, women, and children who built the stairs, cut the stone, cooked the food, and slept on cold floors after 16 hours of work. George Washington wrote about freedom, rights, and a new nation, while writing lists of the people he owned, like numbers in a notebook. Some tried to escape this hill, some were punished here. Some lie in unmarked graves just a short walk from the pretty front door. Today, school buses arrive. Guides talk about great men and great history. But how do you tell the story of a hero whose house was built on slavery? And the hardest question is this: can a mansion built on stolen lives ever be just a beautiful landmark? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Chapter 1. Welcome to America's most famous house. Your support makes these detailed stories possible, and today, we need that support more than ever. Because the story we are about to tell is not simple. It is not comfortable. But it is true. Dawn breaks over the Potomac River. Mist rises from the water, soft and silver, drifting across a landscape that has witnessed more than 2.5 centuries of American history. On a hill overlooking the river sits a white mansion with a distinctive red roof and a long piazza facing the water, Mount Vernon. For many people, the most famous private home in America. Every year, approximately 1 million visitors walk these grounds. They come from every state and from dozens of countries. School buses line the parking lot each spring. Families pose for photographs on the bowling green. Tour guides speak in practiced, reverent tones about leadership, character, and the founding of a nation. The house itself seems designed to inspire that reverence. The east-facing porch stretches nearly the full length of the building, offering wide views of the river that George Washington loved. A cupola crowns the roof, topped with a dove of peace as a weather vane. Inside, rooms display period furniture, original paint colors painstakingly restored, and artifacts that once belonged to the Washington family. Visitors often describe the experience as walking into history. The phrase appears in reviews and in social media posts. Mount Vernon looks like a carefully prepared movie set of American greatness. The manicured lawns, the geometric gardens, the white wooden columns. Everything suggests order, beauty. And the steady hand of a man presented as someone who built a nation. But there is another truth the postcard view does not show. Walk past the mansion, away from the main tour route, and you find a different Mount Vernon. Down a narrow path, partially hidden by trees, sits a small clearing. A simple stone marker stands there, placed in 1929. It reads, "In memory of the many faithful colored servants of the Washington family buried at Mount Vernon from 1760 to 1860. The language tells you something about how this story was told for a long time. Faithful, servants, words that soften and obscure, words that turn a system of ownership and control into the illusion of a loyal household staff. The reality was this: more than 300 enslaved people lived and worked at Mount Vernon during George Washington's lifetime. They were not servants. They were property. Human beings listed in plantation ledgers alongside livestock and farm equipment. Men, women, and children who could be bought, sold, punished, or separated from their families at the will of their owner. And their owner was George Washington. Commander of the Continental Army. First President of the United States. The man whose face appears on the $1 bill and whose name marks the nation's capital. The father of his country. This is the paradox at the heart of Mount Vernon. The same hands that helped turn the ideals of the American Revolution into reality also signed documents purchasing human beings. The same mind that strategized victory over British rule also calculated how to extract the maximum possible labor from people who had no freedom of their own. For most of Mount Vernon's history as a public site, this paradox was managed through silence or through careful euphemism. Tour guides spoke of workers and household staff. Interpretive materials focused on Washington's military genius and political wisdom. The enslaved community, their names, their families, their daily routines, their skills, their fears, their suffering, existed mostly in the margins. In recent decades, this has begun to change. Modern scholarship has recovered hundreds of names from Washington's meticulous records. Archaeological excavations have revealed the foundations of slave quarters, the remnants of personal belongings, the physical evidence of lives lived under bondage. Descendants of Mount Vernon's enslaved community have shared family histories passed down through generations. Today, visitors can walk through reconstructed slave quarters. They can view exhibits dedicated to the lives of specific enslaved individuals. They can stand in that cemetery clearing and learn that it likely contains the remains of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people whose individual graves were never marked. Yet even with these additions, attention remains. Mount Vernon still functions primarily as a shrine to George Washington. The mansion still dominates the landscape. The gift shop still sells miniature busts and commemorative coins. Children still hear the cherry tree story, even though it was almost certainly invented by an early biographer. How do we hold both truths at once? How do we honor what was genuinely revolutionary about the American founding, while also acknowledging the brutal system that made places like Mount Vernon possible? There is no tidy answer. But these are the questions this documentary will explore. We will walk through Mount Vernon not as tourists seeking simple inspiration, but as investigators seeking honest history. We will examine the records that Washington kept, the letters he wrote, the decisions he made. We will meet, as best we can across the distance of centuries, the enslaved people who built his fortune and maintained his home. We will trace what happened to them and to their descendants after Washington's death, and we will ask what it means to visit Mount Vernon today. What do we owe to the dead? What do we owe to truth? What do we owe to ourselves? As inheritors of a history that is both glorious and shameful, the Potomac keeps flowing past the hill. The mansion keeps standing. But the story it tells depends on who is speaking and on who is willing to listen. Let us begin. Chapter 2. The Missing Names on the Perfect Tour. The standard Mount Vernon tour takes approximately 45 minutes. Visitors move through the mansion in small groups, guided by staff members trained to narrate the life of George Washington. The route is carefully designed so that each room reveals another facet of the man: his military career, his political philosophy, his taste in furniture, his relationship with Martha. The tour begins in the central passage, a wide hallway that cuts through the middle of the house. Here, guides explain how Washington expanded the original structure, turning a modest farmhouse into the grand residence visitors see today. The walls display a key to the Bastille, a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette. In this space, visitors hear about the famous guests who walked these floorboards: Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and the French general who helped secure victory in the Revolution. From there, the route proceeds through the West Parlor, the small dining room, and the large dining room where Washington entertained dignitaries. Each space is presented as a chapter in a story of refinement and hospitality. The guides point out the vivid green wallpaper, the imported mahogany furniture, the silver candlesticks that would have gleamed during evening gatherings. Upstairs, visitors step into Washington's study, where he managed his extensive correspondence and business affairs. They peer into bedrooms that housed family members and guests. They pause at the second-floor windows to admire the view of the Potomac, the same river panorama Washington saw each morning when he rose before dawn. Throughout this tour, certain words appear again and again. Innovation. Washington was an innovative farmer who experimented with crop rotation and new techniques. Discipline. He enforced strict discipline in both military and domestic life. Hospitality. Mount Vernon was famous for the generous stream of guests who were rarely turned away. Other words appear far less frequently, or not at all. The guides may mention servants or the enslaved people who worked here. The phrasing shifts from tour to tour. Some guides speak more directly than others, but in the flow of a 45-minute journey through 18 rooms, these references usually occupy only a few minutes. A brief acknowledgement, a transitional phrase between anecdotes. Then the group moves on to the next polished detail of Washington's greatness. This imbalance is not simply a matter of individual choice. Guides work from scripts developed over many years. They have limited time and a packed storyline. Most visitors arrive expecting to learn about George Washington, and that expectation shapes what is emphasized and what is pushed to the edges. But consider what this structure teaches. A visitor who only takes the mansion tour spends 45 minutes orbiting a single figure. They learn his favorite color for walls. They learn which chair he preferred. They hear about his dentures, his height, his final illness. They do not learn the names of the people who polished that chair until it's shown. They do not learn who cooked the meals served in the dining room or who stood for hours over hot coals in the kitchen. They do not learn who washed Washington's clothes, tended his horses, or nursed his children and relatives through sickness. These people existed. They lived on the same property, walked the same paths, and breathed the same humid Virginia air. They laughed, worried, argued, and dreamed. Yet in the traditional tour, they are treated like ghosts, felt but rarely seen, present only as absence, mentioned as a category, almost never as individuals, with names and stories. The mansion tour ends at the gift shop. Here, visitors can purchase books, souvenirs, and reproductions. They can pick up a replica of Washington's sword or a tea towel printed with his image. They can buy children's books that retell his life in simple scenes and heroic moments. Very few of these items confront slavery directly. The gift shop, like the tour, offers a curated version of the past, one designed to inspire pride and comfort, not discomfort or moral unease. Yet Mount Vernon has changed. If you walk outside the mansion, past the outbuildings and gardens, you will eventually reach something the standard tour only briefly mentions, if at all: the slave quarters, or rather reconstructions of slave quarters. The original buildings deteriorated long ago. What stands now was built using archaeological evidence and historical records. Two small structures with low ceilings and narrow bunks, spaces where families of 8 or 10 people might have slept in an area smaller than Washington's private study. The contrast is intentional and impossible to miss once you see it. The mansion rises with high ceilings, tall windows, and formal symmetry. The quarters crouch low to the ground, dark and cramped, with barely enough space for bodies and belongings. Inside these reconstructed buildings, interpretive panels tell a different set of stories. Here visitors encounter names: Caroline, Hercules, Ona Judge, Christopher Shields, people with specialized skills in cooking, carpentry, and agriculture, people with relationships, hopes, fears, and sorrows, people who resisted their bondage in ways both dramatic and quiet, by escaping, by negotiating, by holding families together under constant threat. This second tour exists. It is open to anyone who looks for it. but it demands more from the visitor. It requires extra steps, extra time, and a willingness to leave the comfortable narrative of the big house and step into a space built around exploitation and control. Many visitors never make that walk. They see the mansion, pose for their photographs, browse the gift shop, and leave with the story they expected to hear. Washington the hero, Mount Vernon the shrine, America the beautiful and uncomplicated. But the other story waits. It has always waited. It lingers in the reconstructed quarters. It lies in the archaeological sites still being excavated. It hides in the archives where Washington's own records list human beings, alongside tools and livestock, line after line in neat handwriting. And it lingers in that small clearing with the simple stone marker, the cemetery where enslaved people were buried without individual graves, without carved headstones, without the formal dignity of the elaborate tomb that shelters Washington and Martha. The question, then, is not whether this story exists. The question is whether we choose to hear it, and whether we are willing to let it change the way we see this perfect tour and this famous house. Chapter 3. From Hilltop Farm to Plantation Machine. To understand Mount Vernon as it existed in Washington's time, we first have to see how it grew. The grand estate visitors walk through today did not appear overnight. It evolved across decades, expanding in size and complexity with each passing year. And with each expansion came a deeper entanglement with the institution of slavery. The land itself has a much longer history than any building on it. For thousands of years before European colonization, indigenous peoples lived along the Potomac River. The Piscataway and Doeg nations knew these forests, fished these waters, hunted these hills. Their presence was pushed back and broken by disease, displacement, and violence as English settlers claimed the region in the 17th century. The property that would become Mount Vernon first entered the Washington family in 1674. George's great-grandfather, John Washington, received a land grant from the colonial government of Virginia. The family held on to this land for generations, even as it passed through various relatives before finally reaching George himself. When George Washington was born in 1732, the property belonged to his father, Augustine. The original house was modest by later standards, a simple 1.5-story structure with 4 rooms, a farmhouse suitable for a middling Virginia planter. Nothing in that early house suggested the future image of national greatness. Augustine Washington died when George was 11 years old. The property passed to George's older half-brother Lawrence, who renamed it Mount Vernon after a British admiral he admired. Lawrence expanded the house, adding a full second story. He also expanded the enslaved workforce, recognizing that Virginia tobacco farming required large amounts of labor. George Washington took control of Mount Vernon in 1761, after Lawrence's death and the later death of Lawrence's widow. He was 29 years old. He had already served as a military officer in the French and Indian War. He had already begun to form the ambitions that would shape his life. What he inherited was substantial, but not extraordinary. Approximately 2,000 acres of land, a house that was comfortable but not grand, and roughly 18 enslaved people whose labor made the property function. Within 3 decades, Washington would transform this inheritance beyond recognition. The numbers tell part of that story. By the time of Washington's death in 1799, Mount Vernon encompassed approximately 8,000 acres divided among 5 separate farms. The mansion had effectively doubled in size through 2 major expansions. The enslaved population had grown from 18 to more than 300 people. This growth was not random. It was planned. Washington approached plantation management with the same methodical attention he would later bring to military campaigns. He read agricultural treatises. He corresponded with farmers across the Atlantic world. He experimented with crop rotation, fertilization techniques, and new varieties of seeds. But every one of these innovations depended on a constant foundation: enslaved labor. Consider what it took to transform Mount Vernon from a modest farm into a showpiece estate. The house expansions alone required enormous effort. Trees had to be felled and milled into lumber. Clay had to be dug, formed into bricks, and fired in kilns. Stone had to be quarried and hauled. Lime had to be burned for mortar and plaster. Enslaved workers performed all of this labor. They cut the timber. They made the bricks. Some estimates suggest that Mount Vernon's enslaved brickmakers produced more than 1 million bricks during Washington's ownership. Each brick was formed by hand, dried in the sun, stacked in kilns, and fired for days. Back-breaking work carried out in summer heat and winter cold. Inside the house, enslaved carpenters crafted the woodwork that visitors admire today: the carved stair rails, the paneled walls, the decorative moldings. These were not simple tasks. They required years of training and considerable skill. Yet the craftsmen who created them received no wages, no public recognition, and no freedom. Beyond construction, the daily operation of Mount Vernon demanded constant labor. The 5 farms produced wheat, corn, and other crops that needed planting, hoeing, harvesting, and processing. Livestock required feeding, watering, and care. Fences had to be mended. Tools had to be repaired and sharpened. The mansion itself was a complex household that relied on dozens of workers. Cooks prepared meals for the Washington family and for the seemingly endless stream of guests. House servants cleaned rooms, washed linens, hauled water, and emptied chamber pots. Stable hands cared for horses. Gardeners maintained the elaborate grounds that displayed Washington's wealth and taste to visitors. Washington recorded all of this with meticulous care. His papers include work logs listing daily tasks assigned to enslaved workers. They include inventories that count human beings alongside cattle and sheep. They include correspondence discussing purchases and sales, as well as the punishment of those who resisted or fled. These records reveal a man who understood exactly what his wealth required. Washington knew the names of his enslaved workers. He knew their skills and their perceived weaknesses. He tracked their productivity with the same attention he gave to crop yields and livestock breeding. The transformation of Mount Vernon was, in this sense, a transformation built quite literally on human bodies. Every brick in the walls, every board in the floors, every meal served in the elegant dining room, all of it depended on people who had no say in the matter. The estate grew more beautiful to outside eyes. The mansion grew more impressive. Washington grew more wealthy and more famous. But that growth had a cost, and that cost was measured in stolen lives and years of forced labor that turned a hilltop farm into a finely tuned plantation machine. Chapter 4: George Washington. 2 lives in 1 man. The man who built this empire of land and labor remains one of history's most complicated figures. George Washington often appears in American memory as a marble statue, literally. His likeness stands in stone and bronze across the nation. Monuments, memorials, and currency present a face of calm authority, the father of his country, the indispensable man. But marble does not show contradiction, and contradiction defined Washington's relationship with slavery from beginning to end. Consider the public Washington, commander of the Continental Army, leading ragged troops against what was then the world's greatest military power. President of the Constitutional Convention, guiding fractious delegates toward a new form of government. First President of the United States, establishing precedents that would shape the office for centuries. This Washington spoke often and eloquently about liberty. He risked his life for independence. He voluntarily surrendered power when he could have held it indefinitely, a choice that astonished observers accustomed to rulers who clung to authority until death. Now consider the private Washington, owner of human beings, manager of a labor system built on coercion and violence, a man who tracked his enslaved workers with the same cool attention he gave to military logistics and crop reports. These two Washingtons inhabited the same body. They wrote with the same hand. They made decisions that shaped both a nation's ideals and hundreds of individual lives lived in bondage. The historical record shows that Washington understood this contradiction. He did not ignore it. In letters to friends and associates, he expressed discomfort with slavery. He called it a moral evil. He wrote about hoping it would eventually disappear from American society. In the year 1786, he wrote to a friend, "I never mean, unless some particular circumstance should compel me to it, to possess another slave by purchase, it being among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by which slavery in this country may be abolished by law." Those words suggest a man troubled by the system that enriched him, a man who recognized the gap between revolutionary ideals and plantation reality. But words are easy, actions reveal more. During the very years when Washington expressed these private doubts, Mount Vernon's enslaved population continued to grow. Not primarily through purchases, Washington largely kept his pledge to avoid buying more people, but through birth. Children born to enslaved mothers inherited their mother's status. This was Virginia law. This was the mechanism by which slavery renewed itself, generation after generation. Washington benefited directly from this system, even as he criticized it on paper. Each child born at Mount Vernon represented future labor, future value, future wealth that could be passed down. He also benefited from his marriage to Martha Custis, a wealthy widow who brought substantial property into their union. This property included enslaved people, dozens of them, who were legally designated as dower slaves. They belonged to the Custis estate and were held in trust for Martha's children from her first marriage. Washington controlled their labor but could not legally free them. This legal complexity would later shape Washington's choices about emancipation in his will, but it does not explain how he treated enslaved people during his lifetime. The surviving records show a master who demanded productivity. Work logs tracked daily tasks with almost military precision. Enslaved workers who failed to meet expectations faced consequences. Washington authorized whipping for a range of perceived offenses. He approved the sale of troublesome individuals to the Caribbean, a fate widely understood as a near-certain death sentence, given the brutal conditions on sugar plantations. He also pursued those who escaped. When an enslaved woman named Ona Judge fled from the presidential household in Philadelphia in the year 1796, Washington spent years attempting to recapture her. He used intermediaries to avoid public embarrassment. He offered deals. He made threats. Ona Judge remained free, living in New Hampshire until her death decades later. But Washington never stopped considering her as property and never accepted her decision as legitimate. This pursuit reveals something important. Washington's private doubts about slavery did not translate into recognition of enslaved people's right to freedom. He could question the institution in letters to friends while simultaneously hunting a woman who had simply claimed the liberty he celebrated in public life. The contradiction deepens when we examine his presidency. Washington served 2 terms from 1789 to 1797. During this period, the nation's capital moved from New York to Philadelphia. Pennsylvania law granted freedom to enslaved people who resided in the state for 6 continuous months. Washington found a way around that law. He rotated his enslaved household workers back to Virginia before the 6-month deadline. This was deliberate. This was calculated. The man celebrated as the father of liberty personally ensured that the people who served him would never gain access to the freedom Pennsylvania law offered. He did this quietly. He instructed his secretary to manage the rotations under pretext that may deceive both them and the public. Deception in the service of bondage. From the man school children still learn, could not tell a lie. The marble statue shows none of this. The monuments remember the general, the president, the founder. They do not remember the enslaved people he rotated through Philadelphia to keep them from claiming legal freedom. They do not remember Ona Judge, living in New Hampshire, carrying the memory of what she escaped. 2 lives in one man, both equally real, both equally part of the story we tell when we say the name George Washington. Chapter 5. One runaway changes the story. Ona Judge was not the only person who chose freedom over Mount Vernon. Throughout Washington's ownership, enslaved people pushed back against their bondage in ways both dramatic and quiet. Some ran, some sabotaged work, some simply refused to break under a system designed to crush the human spirit. But certain stories cut through the historical record with particular force. They crack open the polished narrative of the Founding Father and reveal the human beings living beneath his authority. Ona Judge is one such story. There are others. Consider Hercules, the enslaved chef who commanded Washington's kitchen. His life shows both the complexity of slavery at Mount Vernon and the clear, simple human desire not to be owned. Hercules was not an ordinary enslaved worker. He possessed extraordinary culinary skill that made him invaluable to the Washington household. He prepared elaborate meals for presidential guests. He managed a kitchen staff. He created dishes that impressed diplomats and dignitaries from around the world who sat at Washington's table. His talent brought privileges rarely available to enslaved people. Washington allowed Hercules to sell kitchen scraps for his own profit. This arrangement let him accumulate money and purchase fine clothing. Visitors to Philadelphia described him as an elegant figure, walking city streets in silk waistcoats and polished shoes, a man who looked, from the outside, almost like a free gentleman. But privileges are not freedom. Hercules understood that difference perfectly. In the year 1797, as Washington prepared to leave the presidency and return permanently to Mount Vernon, Hercules disappeared. He escaped from the estate on the eve of Washington's birthday celebration. The timing was no accident. It felt like a deliberate choice, almost like a wordless message. Washington was furious. He launched efforts to recapture his prized chef, sending inquiries and seeking information. But Hercules was never found. Years later, one of Washington's step-granddaughters encountered Hercules' daughter, who remained enslaved at Mount Vernon. The young woman asked the girl if she missed her father. The response became famous. "Oh, sir, I am very glad," she reportedly said, "because he is free now." A child celebrating her father's escape, even though it meant she might never see him again. Even though she remained in bondage while he tasted liberty. Those words carry weight across centuries. They make clear that enslaved people understood exactly what was being stolen from them. Not all resistance took the form of a daring escape under cover of night. The historical record hints at countless smaller acts of defiance, workers who slowed their pace when overseers looked away, tools that mysteriously broke, crops that somehow failed despite adequate care. Washington complained constantly about the productivity of his enslaved workforce. His letters are full of frustration at what he saw as laziness, stubbornness, and incompetence. He never seems to have fully considered a different explanation, that people forced to work without pay or choice might not share his enthusiasm for maximizing output on his estate. This quiet resistance was dangerous. Discovery meant punishment, whipping, extra labor, or worse. Yet it persisted because the alternative, complete submission to the system, was unbearable. Some enslaved people at Mount Vernon used the chaos of the American Revolution itself as a chance to seek freedom. When British forces offered liberty to enslaved people who escaped patriot owners and reached their lines, many took the risk. Washington lost several enslaved workers this way. He wrote of these losses as theft of his property, even as he commanded a war justified by the claim that all men possess natural rights. The runaways who reached British lines faced uncertain futures. Some died of disease in overcrowded camps. Some were re-enslaved when British promises turned out to be thin or temporary. Some eventually reached lasting freedom in Canada, Sierra Leone, or other places beyond American control. Their choices reveal clear thinking about the revolution's meaning. They heard the rhetoric of liberty. They understood that it applied to them as much as to any white colonist shouting about rights. And they acted on that understanding, even when the risks were enormous and the outcome was unclear. For those who remained trapped at Mount Vernon, community became a form of survival. Enslaved people formed families despite laws that refused to recognize their marriages. They built networks of mutual support across the 5 farms that made up Washington's estate. They developed spiritual practices that blended African traditions with Christianity, creating a faith that could hold both suffering and hope. On Sundays, their only day of partial rest, some walked miles to visit spouses or children living on different farms. These journeys were exhausting and ate up the few hours not spent in forced labor. But keeping family connections alive was worth any cost. It was a way of saying, we are more than the roles this system assigns us. The community also preserved memory. Stories passed from parents to children. Names of ancestors were repeated and remembered even when official records ignored them. Skills, songs, and knowledge traveled quietly from generation to generation. This preservation matters because the official archive is painfully incomplete. Washington's meticulous records document births, deaths, rations, and work assignments. They rarely capture inner lives. His ledgers record that a child was born. They do not record the mother's joy or fear. They record that a worker was whipped. They do not record the pain, the humiliation, or the anger. The stories that enslaved people told each other filled those gaps. Some of those stories survived, carried in families who eventually gained freedom and passed the memories onward. Others disappeared when communities were broken apart, when people were sold or died before they could share what they knew. What remains is still enough to destroy the idea that Mount Vernon's enslaved population was a collection of passive, voiceless victims. They were people who loved, fought, worried, hoped, and resisted. People who understood their circumstances with painful clarity. People who made choices inside constraints most of us can barely imagine. Their resistance did not end slavery at Mount Vernon. It did not bring down the system that held them, but it preserved something essential: their humanity, their sense of self, their refusal to be only what the plantation ledger said they were. In a structure designed to deny that humanity, they kept it alive. Chapter 6: The Engine Behind the Mansion. Understanding resistance requires understanding what exactly was being resisted. The daily reality of slavery at Mount Vernon was not just random cruelty, it was a system. A machine designed to squeeze the maximum possible labor out of human bodies. Every beautiful room in the mansion, every acre of productive farmland, every dollar of Washington's considerable wealth depended on that machine running smoothly. Mount Vernon was not a single farm. It was 5 interconnected plantations spread across roughly 8,000 acres. Each farm had its own overseers, its own workforce, its own daily rhythm. Mansion House Farm surrounded the main residence. River Farm, Union Farm, Muddy Hole Farm, and Dogue Run Farm stretched out over the surrounding countryside like separate gears in one large engine. Washington managed this complex operation with almost military precision. He created clear chains of command. He established reporting structures. He demanded weekly reports from each overseer, detailing work completed, problems encountered, and productivity measured and evaluated. The enslaved workforce was divided by skill and function. Field workers formed the largest group, laboring in wheat and corn cultivation that had replaced tobacco as Mount Vernon's primary cash crops. Skilled artisans included blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, and shoemakers. Domestic workers served in the mansion itself, cooking, cleaning, and attending to the Washington family's daily needs and to the endless stream of visitors. For an enslaved field worker, the day began before dawn. Overseers roused people from their quarters while darkness still covered the land. There was no gentle waking. There were bells, shouts, and the ever-present threat of punishment for being slow or late. Breakfast was brief and meager: cornmeal, mush, perhaps a little salt fish. Enough calories to fuel hours of labor, but rarely enough to truly satisfy hunger. Washington calculated rations carefully, always balancing the cost of food against the level of productivity he expected. Work continued until darkness made it impossible to see. In summer, this meant 16 hours or more in the fields: planting, weeding, harvesting, hauling. The tasks shifted with the seasons, but the exhaustion remained constant. Enslaved workers received no wages. They received no real days off except Sundays and a few holidays recognized by the plantation. They received no choice in their assignments. They received no formal respect for their skill, their endurance, or their suffering. The mansion's domestic workers faced different but equally demanding conditions. They rose early to light fires and prepare breakfast. They served meals, cleaned rooms, emptied chamber pots, and washed linens. They remained on call throughout the day, and often late into the night, responding to the needs of the household and its guests. When visitors came to Mount Vernon, and visitors came constantly, the workload multiplied. Washington's hospitality was famous, and he cultivated that reputation. Guests expected elaborate meals, comfortable accommodations, and attentive service. Enslaved workers provided all of this while remaining as invisible as possible, moving in and out of rooms without disturbing the polished illusion of effortless gentility. Caroline Branham worked in the mansion for years. She served Martha Washington directly, helping her dress, managing household tasks, and attending to daily needs. Caroline's labor was intimate and constant. She knew the family's private habits and conversations. She stood in the room for moments of joy and crisis alike. Yet she remained property, someone who could be sold or transferred whenever it suited the interests of others. The skilled artisans occupied a complicated position within this system. Their abilities gave them a kind of value that unskilled workers did not have. A trained blacksmith or carpenter represented years of investment and experience. Washington could not easily replace such workers, which sometimes translated into slightly better food, clothing, or living conditions. But skill was not freedom. Skill meant being too valuable to sell, not free to leave. It meant being hired out to neighbors, generating extra income for Washington, while laboring far from one's own family and community. It meant knowing your talent enriched someone else while you remained in chains. The blacksmith shop at Mount Vernon produced tools, horseshoes, nails, and hardware essential to plantation operations. Enslaved blacksmiths worked in brutal heat, hammering iron for hours each day. Their products built and maintained the estate, yet their names appeared only in work logs and inventories, never on plaques or in public praise. Similarly, enslaved carpenters constructed buildings, made furniture, and performed repairs throughout the property. The fine woodworking that visitors admire today required years of practice and precise skill. These craftsmen matched the abilities of any paid artisan in Virginia, yet they worked without compensation, without recognition, and without the freedom to offer their services on their own terms. Washington's records make clear how well he understood the economics of this system. He calculated the monetary value of each enslaved person. He tracked productivity and punished those he believed were falling short. He understood that his wealth depended on extracting labor while avoiding the costs of wages and voluntary contracts. The numbers are stark. At the time of Washington's death, his estate was valued at over $500,000. A substantial portion of that wealth consisted of enslaved human beings, itemized alongside land, livestock, and equipment. This was the engine behind the mansion, not some vague idea of innovation, not pure genius or the invisible hand of free markets. It was human trafficking and forced labor, organized, measured, and optimized over decades. The beautiful rooms tourists admire today were scrubbed and polished by people who could not leave. The elaborate meals served in the dining room were prepared by people who ate scraps. The manicured grounds were maintained by people who returned at night to cramped quarters with dirt floors and little privacy. Every comfort Washington enjoyed came at the cost of someone else's suffering. This is not a metaphor. It is accounting. His own records, line after line in his own handwriting, prove it. Chapter 7. Hands in the House. Crafting a perfect home. The mansion itself stands as physical evidence of this extraction. Every architectural detail that impresses modern visitors required enslaved hands to create. The elegance tourists admire is inseparable from the labor system that produced it. Washington expanded Mount Vernon twice during his ownership. The first expansion, completed in the early 1770s, added a full third story and extended the house southward. The second expansion, finished in the late 1770s, added the large two-story north wing and the iconic piazza overlooking the Potomac. These were not small projects. They turned a modest Virginia farmhouse into one of the most striking private residences in America, and they required years of intensive labor from dozens of enslaved workers. Consider the bricks alone. Mount Vernon's walls, chimneys, and outbuildings required hundreds of thousands of them. Washington established an on-site brick-making operation staffed entirely by enslaved workers. They dug clay from pits on the property, mixed it with water and sand, and pressed it into wooden molds, one brick at a time. Each brick then dried in the sun for days before firing. The kiln burned for nearly a week, needing constant attention to maintain the proper temperature. Workers loaded and unloaded the kilns in extreme heat, breathing smoke and ash. They stacked finished bricks and hauled them to construction sites across the estate. Estimates suggest that Mount Vernon's enslaved brickmakers produced well over 1 million bricks during Washington's lifetime. 1 million individual units, each formed and handled by human hands. The number staggers the imagination. The labor behind it resists any comforting distance. The woodwork inside the mansion demanded equally intense effort. Washington wanted interiors that projected sophistication and taste. He imported architectural pattern books from England and chose designs meant to impress visitors. Then enslaved carpenters turned those drawings into reality. The main staircase features carved balusters and a mahogany handrail that sweeps elegantly between floors. Each baluster was turned on a lathe, shaped into a matching curve. The handrail required careful joinery to create a smooth, continuous line. Work like this takes years of training and a precise eye. Enslaved carpenters at Mount Vernon possessed that training and that eye. They crafted window frames, door casings, chair rails, and decorative moldings throughout the house. They built furniture when imported pieces proved too expensive. They repaired damage from storms, hard use, and the constant movement of guests and servants through the rooms. Their names appear only occasionally in Washington's records. Lists of workers show who was assigned to the carpenter's gang and which projects they completed. But the records rarely acknowledge their skill. They track labor and materials. They do not praise the craftsmanship that still fills every room. The plastered walls and ceilings posed another technical challenge. Plastering meant mixing lime, what steenmine sand, and animal hair into a workable compound, then applying it in multiple layers that had to cure properly between coats. The decorative ceiling in the large dining room, with its elaborate moldings, demanded particular expertise and timing. Enslaved plasterers created these surfaces. They worked on scaffolding in tight spaces, lifting heavy wet plaster overhead until their arms ached. They smoothed and shaped material that dried quickly, leaving little room for hesitation or error. The flawless walls and ceilings visitors see today represent countless hours of demanding, repetitive labor. Even the mansion's exterior involved significant craft. Washington wanted the wooden siding to resemble stone, a fashionable look that required specialized treatment. Enslaved workers applied multiple coats of paint mixed with sand, then scored the surface to imitate masonry joints. This technique, called rustication, fooled many visitors into believing Mount Vernon was built of stone. The illusion required constant upkeep. Every few years, workers reapplied the sand paint mixture and rescored the lines. The appearance of effortless wealth demanded steady, invisible effort to sustain. Inside, enslaved workers maintained standards that matched the architecture. Floors had to be scrubbed regularly. Silver needed polishing. Brass hardware demanded buffing to hold its shine. Windows were washed. Linens were laundered and ironed. Fireplaces were cleared of ash and soot after each use. Martha Washington supervised this domestic operation with exacting precision. She expected rooms to meet strict standards of order and cleanliness. She inspected work herself and corrected anything that did not meet her expectations. Her manner combined the surface charm of Southern gentility with absolute authority over the people who served her. The contrast between appearance and reality was stark. Visitors to Mount Vernon praised its elegance and order. They admired the tasteful furnishings and spotless rooms. They complimented the Washingtons on their beautiful home and their generous hospitality. They rarely named the enslaved workers who made that beauty possible. When they mentioned them at all, it was with the casual dismissal common in slaveholding society. Servants, attendants, help. People whose labor was assumed, whose presence dissolved into the background, whose humanity was ignored. Today, historians work to bring those workers back into focus. Archaeological excavations have uncovered tools, personal items, and living spaces that reveal fragments of daily life. Archival research has linked names in ledgers to specific skills and projects, reconnecting individuals to the work they performed. But the mansion itself remains the most powerful evidence. Every brick laid, every board carved, every surface polished. The hands that created this carefully crafted perfection belonged to people who could never fully enjoy it. People who slept in cramped quarters while guests stretched out in spacious bedrooms. People who built a monument to someone else's greatness and then slipped back into the shadows so the monument would appear effortless. Chapter 8. Families on a knife's edge. Behind the statistics and labor records lived human beings who loved each other. They formed families inside a system built to deny them even that basic right. They raised children knowing those children could be taken at any moment. They built relationships that slaveholders could sever with a single decision and a single signature. Virginia law did not recognize marriages between enslaved people. A wedding ceremony might take place, performed by an enslaved preacher, or simply marked by the community. Vows were spoken, prayers were said, but the union carried no legal weight. Either spouse could be sold, transferred, or hired out with no regard for the bond between them. At Mount Vernon, the structure of the estate made family life even more fragile. The 5 farms stretched across miles of countryside. An enslaved man working at Dog Run Farm might marry a woman living at Mansion House Farm. They would see each other only on Sundays, if nothing interfered. The walk between farms could take hours, eating up most of their single day of partial rest. Washington's records document these scattered families without acknowledging their emotional reality. Ledgers note that a particular worker has a spouse on another farm. They list who belongs where. They do not record the longing, the worry, the quiet counting of days until the next Sunday. They do not record the fear that illness, punishment, or sale might end those visits forever. Children brought joy and terror in equal measure. Joy, because parenthood is a human instinct that survived even here. Terror, because enslaved children inherited their mother's status. A baby born at Mount Vernon was born into bondage, destined for a lifetime of forced labor unless something extraordinary intervened. The first cry of a newborn contained both celebration and dread. Parents taught their children survival skills that free families never needed to consider. How to avoid attracting the overseer's attention. How to read a mood from a single look. How to endure punishment without begging in ways that might make things worse. How to keep a sense of self when every rule, every order, every insult tried to erase it. This was a curriculum of survival, passed from generation to generation. The threat of separation hung over every family like a constant storm cloud. Washington occasionally sold enslaved people, especially those he labeled troublesome. He also shifted workers among his 5 farms according to labor needs, sometimes splitting families in the process. And the dour slaves, who legally belonged to Martha's first husband's estate, faced additional uncertainty, since their fate would eventually be decided by the Custis heirs after Martha's death. Consider one family whose story survives in fragments across multiple documents. Frank Lee and his wife lived at Mount Vernon for decades, raising children who worked alongside them. Frank served as a butler in the mansion, one of the most visible roles available to an enslaved man. He wore fine livery and attended Washington's most important guests, moving through the house with practiced grace. But visibility did not mean security. Frank's children grew up knowing their family could be divided by death, debt, or decision at any time. They watched other families torn apart. They listened as whispered news spread that a husband had been sent to another farm, that a child had been sold away, that a mother had been hired out miles down the road. They understood that love offered no shield against the fundamental cruelty of the system. Some family separations appear in surviving paperwork. Others vanish into the silence that surrounds so much of enslaved life. A child sold to settle a debt. A spouse transferred to a distant relative's plantation. A parent dead from illness or exhaustion, leaving children to survive without them. The archive notes a decrease in numbers. It does not note the moment a child realizes they will never see a parent again. The emotional toll cannot be measured in ledgers. How do you quantify a mother's grief when her child is sold away? How do you calculate the damage done to children who watch a sibling dragged from the only home they know? The records track bodies and labor. They do not track broken hearts, sleepless nights, or the quiet tears shed after dark. Yet families persisted. They found ways to hold on to each other across distances and dangers. They created networks of information that carried news between farms and even between plantations. They held on to hope when hope looked irrational, because abandoning it entirely would have meant surrendering their sense of self. For many, religion offered both comfort and language for that hope. Enslaved people at Mount Vernon practiced Christianity, often blending it with African spiritual traditions preserved through memory and song. They gathered for worship on Sundays, singing hymns that spoke of deliverance and justice, identifying with stories of captivity and exodus. They prayed for freedom in this life, and if not in this life, then in the next. These gatherings served practical purposes as well. They created rare spaces where people could speak more freely, share news, and check on relatives. They strengthened community bonds that helped individuals endure the harshest moments. Within these circles of prayer and song, enslaved people could exist as full human beings, not just as units of labor watched by overseers. Music and storytelling filled the little time that remained. Songs passed down from African ancestors mingled with new verses shaped by American bondage. Stories preserved histories that official records ignored, tales of resistance, of escape, of earlier generations. Elders taught children who they were and where they came from, protecting identity against a system trying to erase it. Small acts of care sustained family bonds day after day. A mother, saving part of her meager rations for a hungry child. A father walking miles on Sunday just to hold his children for a few hours. Grandparents taking on extra tasks so younger adults could rest. A friend sharing medicine or herbs when someone fell sick. These acts of love were also acts of resistance. The system wanted enslaved people to be interchangeable, nameless units of labor. Families insisted on their individuality, their relationships, their history. Every marriage celebrated, every child cherished, every nickname, every inside joke was a quiet victory against dehumanization. Washington's records show that he understood the power of these family bonds. He sometimes used the threat of separation as a disciplinary weapon. He knew that selling a spouse or child was the ultimate punishment, more feared than whipping. That knowledge reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the man behind the marble monuments. He understood love, and he knew exactly how to turn it into a tool of control. Chapter 9. Liberty for a Nation, Not for the Plantation. The American Revolution promised transformation. Its rhetoric rang with phrases that sounded universal. All men are created equal. Unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Enslaved people across the colonies heard those words and understood exactly what they implied about their own lives. At Mount Vernon, the revolution arrived as both opportunity and uncertainty. In the year 1775, Washington left to command the Continental Army. He would not return permanently for roughly 8 years. During his absence, Martha managed the estate with the help of overseers and relatives. The enslaved workforce continued its labor, watching events unfold from a position of enforced silence. But silence did not mean ignorance. Enslaved people followed the war's progress through overheard conversations, rumor networks, and their own observations. They understood that a conflict between colonies and crown might tear holes in the system that held them. Through those holes, some might run. So they waited, listened, and watched for a chance. The British offered such a chance. In November of 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation promising freedom to enslaved people who escaped Patriot owners and joined British forces. The offer was strategic, not compassionate. Britain wanted to destabilize the colonial economy and recruit labor and soldiers. But for people in chains, motives mattered less than the possibility of getting out of those chains. Thousands responded to Dunmore's proclamation and to similar British offers throughout the war. They fled plantations across the South, risking capture, disease, and death for even a slim possibility of liberty. Some reached British lines and found protection. Others were caught and dragged back, facing brutal punishment for daring to claim the freedom white patriots shouted about in speeches. Mount Vernon was not exempt from this tide. Historical records identify at least 17 enslaved people from the estate who escaped to British forces when enemy ships sailed up the Potomac in 1781. They boarded vessels that represented danger, but also the first real path toward freedom they had ever seen. They left behind the only home they had known, because that home had never been theirs. Their names appear in Washington's documents as property lost: Harry, Frederick, Gunnar, Daniel, Deborah, and several women and children. The entries express anger and frustration at the loss, tallying economic damage, rather than acknowledging human courage. The paperwork reads like a farm report. The reality was a jailbreak. What happened to these escapees remains partly hidden by time. Some likely died from smallpox and other diseases that tore through British camps. Conditions for black loyalists, as they came to be called, were often grim. British promises did not always hold. Many freedom seekers were re-enslaved or abandoned once their military usefulness faded. Others survived and reached permanent freedom. After the British defeat, several thousand black loyalists evacuated with departing royal forces. They sailed to Nova Scotia, the Bahamas, Sierra Leone, and other places beyond American control. Some of Mount Vernon's escapees may have been among them, trying to build new lives on unfamiliar shores, carrying memories of the Potomac with them. Washington did not simply accept their departure. After the war, he pursued the return of his lost property. He sent agents to New York, where thousands of black loyalists gathered before evacuation. He pressed British commanders to honor treaty provisions calling for the return of American property. In these arguments, he did not pause to consider the irony: a hero of liberty demanding that people who had claimed their own freedom be forced back into bondage. For those who remained at Mount Vernon throughout the war, the Revolution's outcome brought deep disappointment. The new nation Washington helped create did not extend its promises to them. The Constitution, drafted in 1787 with Washington presiding over the convention, protected slavery without ever using the word. The Three-Fifths Compromise counted enslaved people as a fraction of a person for the purpose of congressional representation, boosting the political power of slaveholding states while denying those counted any voice at all. The Fugitive Slave Clause required free states to return escapees to their owners. The document that established American democracy also locked in the survival of American slavery. Washington returned to Mount Vernon in 1783 as the most celebrated man in the country. His military victory had secured independence. His voluntary resignation from command had demonstrated Republican virtue to the world. He looked, to many, like proof that the new nation lived up to its ideals. But the plantation he came home to had not changed. The same enslaved people who had worked the fields before the war were still working them after. The same families slept in the same cramped quarters. The same system of forced labor generated the same wealth for the same owner. If anything, Mount Vernon's enslaved population grew in the post-war years. Births outpaced deaths and escapes. By the time Washington became president in 1789, more than 300 enslaved people lived and worked on his estate. The nation he had liberated existed side by side with a plantation that remained firmly unfree. The contrast between public ideals and private reality could not have been sharper. The man who led a revolution in the name of liberty presided over one of Virginia's largest slave plantations. The man who refused to become a king exercised near absolute authority over hundreds of human beings, who had no rights he was bound to respect. Some observers saw this clearly even then. Abolitionists in the North pointed to slave-holding founders as living proof of American hypocrisy. European visitors wrote home in disbelief that champions of liberty kept people in chains in their own households. Washington heard those criticisms. He felt their weight. His private letters show growing discomfort with slavery as an institution, and a sense that it could not last forever. But discomfort stayed largely on the page. It did not overturn the system at Mount Vernon. The estate continued to operate as it always had, a plantation built on bondage, organized for profit, sustained by stolen labor. The Revolution changed America's political map. It changed flags, uniforms, and laws. It did not change Mount Vernon. Chapter 10. The Will, the Fire, and the Broken Circle. Washington's final years brought him face to face with the contradiction he had managed to sidestep for decades. His health declined after leaving the presidency in the year 1797. He returned to Mount Vernon knowing his remaining time was limited, and he began to think seriously about what would happen to the enslaved people he controlled after his death. The legal situation was complicated. Washington personally owned approximately 123 enslaved people. Another 40 or so were rented from a neighbor. The remaining majority, more than 150 men, women, and children, were dour slaves belonging to the Custis estate. He controlled their labor but could not legally free them. This distinction would shape everything that followed. In July of 1799, about 5 months before his death, Washington drafted his final will. It dealt with the usual matters of property and inheritance. But buried within the legal language was something unusual for a Virginia slaveholder of his era, a detailed provision for emancipation. He directed that the enslaved people he personally owned should be freed upon Martha's death. He specified that elderly or infirm individuals must be supported by his estate for the rest of their lives. He ordered that children without parents should be taught to read and write, then bound out to learn useful trades until they reached adulthood. The language shows real attention to the practicalities of freedom. Washington understood that simply declaring people free without resources or training would leave them in grave danger. On paper, at least, he tried to plan for their transition from bondage to liberty. One man received immediate freedom. William Lee, Washington's personal valet, who had served him throughout the Revolutionary War, was emancipated upon Washington's death rather than Martha's. The will recognized Lee's faithful services during the Revolutionary War and granted him an annual pension of $30 for the rest of his life. At first glance, this can look like a turning point. The father of the country, in his final legal act, choosing emancipation over perpetual bondage. A man who had spent a lifetime benefiting from slavery, finally aligning his private actions with his public ideals. But the reality was more complicated and more painful. The will could only free the people Washington legally owned. The dour slaves, the majority of Mount Vernon's enslaved population, remained property of the Custis estate. Their fate would be decided not by Washington, but by Martha's heirs after her death. That legal line cut straight through the community at Mount Vernon. Over decades on the estate, Washington's enslaved people and the Custis enslaved people had formed families together. Husbands married wives, parents raised children. Grandparents watched several generations grow up, but in the eyes of the law, these relatives belonged to different owners. When Washington's provisions took effect, some family members would become free, while others remained enslaved. A husband might be able to walk away from Mount Vernon while his wife and children stayed behind as someone else's property. A mother might gain liberty, but lose her sons and daughters to Custis heirs scattered across Virginia. Washington knew this would happen. His will admitted the problem openly. He wrote that he could not free the dour slaves, and that liberating only his own people would cause most painful sensations because of the family separations it would cause. He saw the wound coming and still chose a solution that guaranteed it. Martha Washington did not wait for her own death to act. In the year 1800, less than a year after George's passing, she implemented the Emancipation Clause and freed the people her husband had owned. Some accounts suggest she feared for her safety, worried that enslaved people promised future freedom might decide to hurry that future along. Other accounts emphasize her desire to honor his wishes without delay. Whatever her reasons, the emancipation happened. Approximately 123 people gained their legal freedom. They left Mount Vernon and stepped into an uncertain future as free black men, women, and children in a slave-holding republic. Some remained in the area, hiring themselves out as laborers or artisans. Others moved away, trying to put distance between themselves and the place where they had been owned. But the broken circle Washington had anticipated became real almost overnight. Families that had endured generations of bondage together were torn apart, not by a sale on an auction block, but by the uneven line of partial emancipation. A freed father could not legally take his enslaved children with him. A freed wife had no power to liberate her husband. Brothers and sisters found themselves on opposite sides of a legal boundary they had no voice in drawing. The Custis heirs claimed their inheritance. The dower slaves were divided among multiple households, dispersed across Virginia and beyond. People who had shared cabins, meals, and memories for decades were scattered by estate settlements and marriage portions. For many, this was the final separation, the moment when even the thin thread of Sunday visits and shared worship snapped. Some of those separated family members never saw one another again. For them, freedom for one branch of the family meant permanent loss for another. Washington's attempt to balance his conscience against the constraints of law produced exactly the outcome he had called most painful: liberty and devastation in the same stroke. The historical record allows us to trace pieces of this story. Researchers have followed some of the people freed in the year 1801, tracking their lives through census records, church registers, and scattered references in local documents. They have also followed Custis slaves through the white families who inherited them, watching as they were carried to new plantations or held in place until the Civil War. The two paths diverged sharply. The newly freed men and women and their descendants built lives as free black Americans, facing prejudice, legal discrimination, and constant danger, but possessing at least the basic legal fact of not being owned. The Custis descendants remained enslaved for roughly 6 more decades, living and dying inside a system Washington had only partially stepped away from. Washington's will did represent progress. It was one of the largest single acts of emancipation by a Virginia slaveholder in that era. It showed that even a man raised inside slavery, who had profited from it for a lifetime, could eventually choose a different course. But it also exposed the limits of individual conscience inside a deeply entrenched evil. Washington could not free people he did not legally own. He could not prevent families from being split apart by inheritance law. He could not repay decades of stolen labor or erase the pain his choices had caused. In the end, he did what he believed he could do. And history has to live with both halves of that truth: the step he took toward emancipation, and the vast harm that remained untouched when he put his pen down for the last time. Chapter 11. The House Without Its People. After Washington's death, Mount Vernon entered a long decline. The estate that had once symbolized American prosperity and leadership began to crumble. Without its founders' constant attention and deep pockets, the plantation that hundreds of enslaved people had built and sustained slowly began to fall apart. Martha Washington survived her husband by less than 3 years. She died in May of 1802, leaving the mansion and surrounding property to Bushrod Washington, George's nephew, and a justice of the Supreme Court. Bushrod inherited the house and the legend, but not the fortune required to keep either in perfect condition. The financial reality was stark. Mount Vernon had always been an expensive operation. Washington's meticulous management had kept it just barely productive enough to support itself. His death removed the driving force behind that fragile balance. Income declined while the costs of upkeep, repairs, labor, supplies remained the same or grew. Bushrod Washington faced choices that were difficult and, in many ways, impossible. He could not afford the full workforce needed to maintain the grounds and buildings as they had looked in George's time. He lacked his uncle's energy, connections, and appetite for agricultural experimentation. Year after year, he watched as roofs leaked, fences sagged, and once precise gardens slipped out of order. At the same time, the enslaved community that had held the place together scattered in multiple directions. Those freed by Washington's will left to seek new lives beyond the plantation boundaries. The Custis Dower slaves were divided among Martha's grandchildren and sent to other estates across Virginia. The tight-knit community that had existed for decades dissolved. Families already strained by the partial emancipation found themselves pulled even further apart. Networks of mutual support, built over generations, broke under the pressure of inheritance and sale. The social world that had helped enslaved people survive their bondage at Mount Vernon simply ceased to exist. For those who remained on the property under Bushrod's ownership, conditions worsened as money ran short. Financial pressure translated into harsher treatment and hard decisions. Some enslaved people were sold to raise cash, their destinations unrecorded, their fates unknown. The relative stability that had characterized Washington's highly controlled management gave way to constant uncertainty and fear. Bushrod Washington died in 1829 and passed the estate to his nephew, John Augustin Washington. The decline continued. John Augustin faced the same structural problems: high costs, low income, and a famous house that demanded more than it could earn. The mansion leaked. Outbuildings sagged or collapsed. Gardens that had once showcased Washington's taste grew wild and unkempt. During these years, tourists began arriving in greater numbers, drawn by Washington's legend and the growing cult of national memory. They came expecting a shrine to American greatness. Instead, many found neglect. Visitors wrote of peeling paint, broken windows, sagging porches, and overgrown pathways. Some chipped off pieces of plaster or wood as souvenirs, literally breaking the house apart to carry a fragment of it home. The slave quarters fell into especially severe disrepair. These buildings had never been constructed to last for generations. Built of wood with minimal foundations and little investment, they required constant maintenance to remain even marginally habitable. Without that work, they rotted, collapsed, and disappeared. By the middle of the 19th century, the physical traces of the enslaved community were vanishing. The cabins where they had lived became piles of ruined timber. The vegetable gardens they had tended turned back to scrub and weeds. The paths they had worn into the ground faded as no one walked them anymore. The cemetery suffered a similar and even more haunting neglect. The burial ground where generations of enslaved people had been laid to rest received no regular care. Wooden grave markers decayed and fell. The few stone markers that existed were swallowed by brush and shifting soil. Within a few decades, the precise locations of individual graves were lost. Only a general clearing hinted that this had once been sacred ground. This erasure was not purely accidental. American culture in the mid-19th century preferred a version of Washington unburdened by his slaveholding. The myth of the flawless father of his country left little space for the reality of the enslaved men, women, and children who had built his home and his wealth. As the physical evidence disappeared, the memory it might have anchored slipped away with it. In 1841, John Augustin Washington II inherited the estate and the same financial crisis. He appealed to both the federal government and the state of Virginia, offering to sell Mount Vernon as a public memorial. Neither accepted. The possibility that Washington's home might fall into total ruin or be sold off to private developers became brutally real. The enslaved people who remained on the estate during these decades left almost no written record of their experiences. The detailed documentation that George Washington had maintained ended with his death. His successors kept fewer and thinner records. Individual lives that might have been traceable through earlier account books vanished into historical silence. What little we can reconstruct points to hardship, Shrinking resources meant smaller rations and poorer clothing. Crumbling buildings meant leaky roofs, drafty walls, and dangerous structures. The sale of people to generate funds meant a constant background terror. At any moment, a relative could be taken away. The community that had built Mount Vernon watched it crumble around them. They had laid the bricks, carved the woodwork, planted the trees, and kept the paths neat. Now they were forced to watch as rain, neglect, and souvenir-hungry visitors destroyed what their own hands had made. No diary records their feelings, no letter describes their anger or grief, but it is hard not to imagine the bitter irony. By the 1850s, Mount Vernon stood on the brink of complete collapse. The mansion was structurally compromised. Most of the original outbuildings were gone. The grounds that had once impressed visitors with their symmetry and beauty now showed only erosion, weeds, and decay. The enslaved cemetery had become almost invisible. Thick vegetation covered the clearing. The simple stone marker placed years earlier stood nearly alone, acknowledging a community without naming its members. Hundreds of people lay in unmarked graves, their individual resting places erased by time and neglect. The house without its people was dying, and the people themselves, the ones who built it, sustained it, and made it function, were being pushed out of the story, one collapsed building and one forgotten grave at a time. Chapter 12. Ladies to the Rescue. But which story? Salvation came from an unexpected direction. In the year 1853, a South Carolina woman named Louisa Cunningham traveled by steamboat past Mount Vernon. The sight of the decaying mansion shocked her. Peeling paint, sagging roofs, broken fences. This was the home of George Washington. That evening she wrote to her daughter, Anne Pamela Cunningham, describing the shame of allowing Washington's house to sink into ruin. Anne Pamela Cunningham was an unlikely savior for the estate. Chronic illness had left her largely housebound. She had no experience with public campaigns, no background in fundraising, no formal organization behind her. But her mother's letter did something powerful. It gave her a single, clear mission. That mission would occupy the rest of her life. From her bedroom, Cunningham began writing to newspapers across the South, appealing directly to women. Her articles spoke in the language of patriotism, sentimental duty, and respectable femininity. She called on the ladies of the South to rescue the home of the father of their country from neglect and national embarrassment. The house, she argued, was a sacred relic, and women had a special responsibility to protect it. The response was stronger than anyone expected. Women throughout the South, and soon across the entire country, sent money. They organized fairs, teas, raffles, and concerts. They sold small souvenirs. They persuaded husbands, brothers, and fathers to contribute. Out of Cunningham's sick-room letter writing, a national movement began to form. In the year 1856, Cunningham formally created the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. It became the first national historic preservation organization in the United States. Its single purpose was clear: buy Mount Vernon, restore it, and protect it forever. The model Cunningham invented, private citizens, especially women, raising funds to preserve historic sites, would shape preservation work for generations. Buying the house, however, proved far harder than dreaming of saving it. John Augustine Washington II, then owner of the estate, initially demanded $200,000, an enormous sum for the time. The Ladies' Association had to try to raise that money during an economic downturn, one small donation and one fundraiser at a time. Negotiations dragged on for years. At last, in the year 1858, they reached an agreement. The Ladies' Association would pay the full $200,000, with the final installment due in 1862. In return, they would receive the mansion and approximately 200 acres of surrounding land. The legal papers were signed. Control passed from the Washington family to the Women's Association. Mount Vernon, physically at least, was no longer in danger of vanishing. The timing was almost unbelievable. Less than 3 years later, the Civil War began. Mount Vernon stood in Virginia, now part of the Confederacy, but the Ladies' Association included members from both North and South. Cunningham declared the estate neutral ground, a shrine to Washington that must remain above the conflict, a symbol of national identity even as the nation tore itself apart. Remarkably, both Union and Confederate forces respected this claim. Soldiers from both armies visited Mount Vernon during the war. They left their weapons at the gate, toured the house, and walked the grounds as unarmed visitors. The mansion survived a war that devastated much of Virginia's landscape, but saving the building raised a crucial question. What story would this preserved Mount Vernon tell? From the beginning, the Ladies' Association had to decide how to interpret the place. They had preserved a slaveholders' plantation in the middle of a conflict fought over slavery. They could not escape that fact. The question was whether they would confront it. Their answer, shaped by the racial politics of the 19th century and by their need to appeal to donors in both North and South, was largely to step around it. Early interpretation focused almost entirely on Washington's military heroism and political achievements. Guides described his character, his leadership, his self-sacrifice for the new nation. Slavery appeared, when it appeared at all, as a faint shadow at the edge of this bright portrait. Guides spoke of servants who worked in the house. They referred to workers who kept up the grounds. These words softened the reality of bondage into something almost voluntary. The harshness of forced labor vanished behind polite language. The enslaved community itself slid toward invisibility. The slave quarters, already collapsing before the Ladies' Association took over, were not rebuilt. No reconstructions rose where cabins had stood. The cemetery where enslaved people were buried remained overgrown and largely ignored. The names of the men, women, and children who had built and maintained Mount Vernon went unspoken on official tours. This was not simply a Mount Vernon problem. It reflected wider American attitudes. In the decades after the Civil War, the lost cause myth spread across the South, romanticizing the antebellum era and downplaying slavery's brutality. At the same time, the country as a whole embraced a story of national reunion that glossed over the conflicts that had caused the war. Historic sites across the United States told similarly sanitized stories. At Mount Vernon, the sanding down of history was especially thorough. Washington's status as a slaveholder was not completely erased, but it was pushed into the background. Visitors heard about his greatness without being asked to look closely at the system that supported it. The mansion shone, restored, and carefully maintained, while the history of those who scrubbed its floors and cooked its meals faded almost completely from view. Yet some traces of the enslaved community could not be entirely erased. The cemetery still existed, even if it was choked with vegetation. In the year 1929, the Ladies' Association finally placed a stone marker there that read, "In memory of the many faithful colored servants of the Washington family." The wording itself tells a story. Faithful, a word suggesting loyalty and choice, rather than captivity and coercion. Colored servants, a phrase that avoids the word enslaved and blurs the reality of ownership into a vague idea of employment. The marker acknowledged that people had lived and died there, but it disguised the nature of their relationship to Washington. For decades, that single stone in an overgrown section of the grounds was the main official recognition of the enslaved community at Mount Vernon. No list of names, no individual biographies, no clear statement that the entire estate had been built and run by people who never had the option to leave. The Ladies' Association did succeed brilliantly at their core mission. They prevented Washington's home from collapsing or being carved into private lots. They created a powerful model for private historic preservation that still shapes the field. They kept the estate intact through wars, economic crises, and changing tourist tastes. But in doing so, they also made choices about memory. They chose which parts of Mount Vernon's story to highlight and which parts to keep in the shadows. They built a version of Mount Vernon that celebrated one man as a national icon, while almost entirely forgetting the hundreds of people whose labor had sustained his world. Those choices were not destiny. They were decisions made by specific people, in specific cultural and political conditions. And like any decisions, they can be revisited, questioned, and changed, if we are willing to tell the whole story of the house they saved. Chapter 13. The Cemetery Speaks. Change came slowly to Mount Vernon's story. For most of the 20th century, the official narrative stayed centered on Washington the hero. Tours, plaques, and pamphlets revolved around his character and achievements. The enslaved community appeared only at the edges, mentioned briefly, if at all. But over time, pressure for a more complete and honest narrative began to build. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s transformed how Americans talked about race and history. Activists demanded recognition of Black contributions to the nation's story. Scholars began uncovering histories that had been ignored, distorted, or buried. The comfortable myths that had shaped public memory for generations came under increasing scrutiny. Historic sites felt this shift directly. Places like Mount Vernon, which had long presented polished and simplified narratives, suddenly faced new questions from visitors. Where did the enslaved people live? What were their names? What work did they do? How can you tell Washington's story without telling theirs? The Mount Vernon Ladies' Association responded cautiously at first. Changes appeared in small, almost tentative steps. Tours and educational materials began to include the word enslaved instead of servants. Interpretive signs started to acknowledge that the estate's beauty and order rested on a system of forced labor. The old language did not vanish overnight, but fault lines in the old story had opened. Even with these adjustments, one place on the property carried a different weight from the beginning. The cemetery, that small, quiet clearing, neglected for so long, became the most powerful site of memory for those who wanted Mount Vernon to face its full history. In 1983, Mount Vernon held its first formal ceremony at the burial ground for enslaved people. Descendants of those who had been enslaved there gathered alongside historians, clergy, and community members. At last, names recovered from Washington's records were read aloud in the place where their bearers rested. Prayers were offered for ancestors whose individual graves could no longer be identified. That ceremony marked a turning point. For the first time, Mount Vernon officially acknowledged its responsibility to remember not only George Washington, but also the hundreds of men, women, and children who had served him without choice. The burial ground shifted from an awkward, half-hidden corner of the estate into a recognized sacred space. Archaeological work soon began to reveal what the written records could not. Researchers used ground-penetrating radar and other technologies to map the cemetery without disturbing it. They discovered that the burial ground was far larger than anyone had realized. The evidence suggested that dozens, perhaps more than 75 individuals, lay in unmarked graves beneath the soil. Each grave represented a person, someone who had lived, labored, loved, and suffered at Mount Vernon. Someone whose name might appear in Washington's meticulous ledgers, or whose identity had been lost even there. Someone who deserved more than silence. Archaeology extended beyond the cemetery as well. Excavations across the estate uncovered the foundations of slave quarters. traces of work yards and fragments of daily life, a broken clay pipe, a metal button, a shard of decorated pottery, small objects, but each one a direct link between the present and the people who had once lived on this ground. These physical discoveries pushed back against the simple, heroic narrative of Washington's greatness. They made it impossible to pretend the elegant mansion had ever existed alone. The ruins and artifacts showed that refined dining rooms and formal parlors had always stood beside cramped cabins and crowded workspaces, that fine meals in the big house depended on invisible labor in smoky kitchens and hot fields. The enslaved community became physically present again in ways that words on a brochure could never fully convey. Historians added another layer to this transformation. Researchers returned to Washington's papers with new questions, extracting every detail they could find about the enslaved people he owned and controlled. They traced family relationships across generations. They reconstructed work assignments, skills, illnesses, and punishments. They looked for the small details that turn a name on a list into a human life. This research recovered hundreds of names, not anonymous servants, but specific individuals: Hercules, the chef who used his position to plan and carry out an escape; Ona Judge, who fled the presidential household and refused all attempts to drag her back; Caroline Branham, who served Martha Washington inside the mansion for years; William Lee, who rode beside Washington throughout the Revolution. Every name recovered was a small victory against erasure. Every partial biography pieced together was an act of repair. Slowly, the people who had built and sustained Mount Vernon were restored to the story as people, not just as numbers in an inventory. Modern exhibits at Mount Vernon reflect this changed understanding. The slave quarters have been reconstructed using archaeological evidence and historical records. Visitors can step into the cramped interior spaces where families of 8 or 10 people slept, cooked, and tried to carve out private moments. The contrast between these tight quarters and the mansion's high-ceilinged rooms is no longer hidden. It is the point. Interpretive panels throughout the grounds now tell the stories of specific enslaved individuals. Videos feature historians and descendants speaking directly about what life under bondage was like here. Interactive databases allow visitors to search for names and see what the records reveal about the lives of those who worked on the estate. The cemetery itself has been permanently changed. A memorial, designed by architecture students and installed in 1983, now stands at the site. The area is maintained with care, paths cleared, vegetation controlled, signage in place. It is no longer an overgrown embarrassment, but a place of honor and reflection. Annual commemorations bring descendants, staff, and visitors together to remember those buried there. Yet gaps remain, and always will. Many graves cannot be matched to specific individuals. Many names in Washington's records cannot be connected to precise burial places. For some, even a full name and a few notes in a ledger are all that survive. The violence of slavery included the violence of erasing identities, and no amount of research can fully reverse that. What matters now is the effort and the direction of the story. Mount Vernon today acknowledges that its history is not just the tale of a single celebrated founder. It is also the history of hundreds of enslaved people whose labor made his success possible. The site recognizes that telling Washington's story honestly means telling theirs alongside his. The cemetery speaks for those who were silenced in their own time. It insists that we remember not only greatness, but the cost of that greatness. It refuses to let the comforting version of the American founding float free of the uncomfortable truths beneath it. And year after year, more descendants come. More names are read aloud. More people stand in that clearing and offer prayers, silence, or simple presence for the dead who built this place and received so little recognition in return. Chapter 14. Lives bound together. The work of recovery continues today. Mount Vernon now devotes serious time, money, and staff to researching, documenting, and presenting the lives of its enslaved community. What once appeared as a brief footnote has become a central part of the estate's mission. The shift reflects not only academic progress, but also a slow moral reckoning with what this place was. The Lives Bound Together initiative, launched in the year 2016, stands at the center of this effort. The program focuses on telling the stories of the enslaved people who lived and worked at Mount Vernon. It brings together historians, archaeologists, genealogists, and descendants, weaving their work into a fuller picture of the estate's past. The initiative's name captures something essential. The lives of the Washington family and the lives of the enslaved community were bound together in ways that cannot be separated without breaking the story. The wealth that financed the mansion came from enslaved labor. The comfort the Washingtons enjoyed depended on constant, unchosen service. To understand one side of that relationship, you have to look directly at the other. Modern visitors to Mount Vernon now encounter this intertwined history from the moment they arrive. The standard tour no longer centers only on Washington's achievements. It pauses for the people who made those achievements possible. It names them. It tells fragments of their lives alongside his. The reconstructed slave quarters provide the most visceral lesson. Visitors step into buildings modeled on archaeological evidence and historical descriptions. The ceilings press low. The spaces feel cramped. Wooden bunks line the walls where entire families would have slept shoulder to shoulder. Smoke, noise, and lack of privacy are easy to imagine. The contrast with the mansion is intentional and unsettling. A visitor who has just admired Washington's study, with its generous windows and polished furniture, suddenly stands in a room where 8 or 10 people once lived in a space smaller than that study. The physical experience communicates a truth that no plaque or lecture can fully deliver on its own. Inside these reconstructed quarters, interpretive materials focus on specific individuals. Panels and audio guides describe daily routines, family ties, skills, punishments, and small acts of resistance. The faceless category of enslaved workers breaks apart into particular people with distinct lives. Technology has made this work even more accessible. Mount Vernon's website now includes a searchable database of enslaved individuals. Visitors can enter names, occupations, or family connections and see what the surviving records reveal. A teacher preparing a lesson can build it around real people rather than abstract numbers. A descendant searching for family roots can discover links that were hidden for generations. The database currently holds information on more than 500 individuals who were enslaved at Mount Vernon at different times. Each entry represents hours of archival work, comparing lists, letters, account books, and legal documents to build even a partial biography. The research is ongoing, expanding as new sources and connections surface. Descendants are increasingly central to this process. People whose ancestors were enslaved at Mount Vernon have come forward with family stories, photographs, and oral traditions passed down through generations. Their contributions fill gaps that no ledger or inventory can ever address. These descendants give the history a different kind of weight. When a woman stands in the reconstructed quarters and says that her great-great-grandmother lived in a space like this, the past stops feeling distant. When a man reads his ancestor's name during a ceremony at the cemetery, the voice of history comes through a living person, not just a textbook. Mount Vernon has not waited passively for these connections. Genealogical research has helped identify descendants scattered across the country. The estate has hosted reunions, bringing together families whose branches were split by slavery and everything that followed. At some of these gatherings, relatives meet for the first time, reconnecting lines that were severed more than a century ago. These reunions are both joyful and mournful. They celebrate the fact that families survived slavery, sale, separation, and decades of discrimination. They also mourn what was lost. Relationships broken, stories cut short, possibilities destroyed by laws that treated people as property. Educational programs have expanded in step with this new focus. School groups visiting Mount Vernon now learn about slavery as a central fact of the estate, not a side note to be mentioned in passing. Curriculum materials help teachers prepare students for what they will see and hear. The goal is not to shock for its own sake, but to offer history that is honest, age-appropriate, and unwilling to lie. Special tours now focus specifically on the enslaved community. Visitors can choose experiences that center the lives of those who labored instead of those who owned. These tours follow different routes across the property, highlighting quarters, workspaces, and the cemetery instead of only mansion rooms and formal gardens. These changes have not come without resistance. Some visitors prefer the older version of the story, the uncomplicated hero tale that leaves out the hardest parts. They complain that attention to slavery diminishes Washington or spoils the inspiration they came for. They want a shrine, not a challenge. Mount Vernon has chosen a different path. The estate's leadership has decided that truthful history, even when it is uncomfortable, serves everyone better than myth. Understanding Washington in full means understanding the system that supported him. Celebrating American ideals means facing the times and places where the nation failed to live up to them. This approach now serves as a model for historic sites across the country. It shows that preservation and truth-telling do not have to be enemies. It proves that visitors can handle complexity, that many of them are hungry for it. They do not need a perfect founder. They need a real past. The work is still unfinished. New documents emerge. New descendants come forward. New ways of telling these stories are tested and refined. Mount Vernon today is not a final verdict, but an ongoing conversation. A conversation between past and present, between Washington and the people he owned, between the comforting myths we inherit and the harder truths we have to choose to see. Chapter 15. What it means to visit Mount Vernon. Evening light falls across the Potomac. The river moves on as it has for thousands of years, indifferent to the human dramas that have played out on its banks. The mansion glows against the darkening sky, its white walls catching the last rays of the sun. At dusk, Mount Vernon still looks like a painting of American greatness. But now we know more. We know what that painting leaves outside the frame. A visit to Mount Vernon today is not what it was 50 years ago. The tour has changed. The story has widened. The old silences have started to fill with voices that were pushed aside for generations. Walking these grounds now means meeting complexity, not just collecting patriotic inspiration. The mansion still impresses. The river view still makes you stop and stare. Washington's public achievements still matter. He led a revolution against an empire. He stepped away from power when he could have kept it. He helped create institutions that have lasted for centuries. And at the same time, he owned human beings. He bought and sold them. He pursued those who escaped. He built his wealth on their stolen labor. He slept under a fine roof while they slept in cramped quarters with dirt floors. Both truths stand. Neither erases the other. The challenge for modern visitors is to hold them together, to let the full weight of that contradiction press on us without reaching for an easy way out, without turning him into a saint, and without pretending that context alone excuses everything. The enslaved cemetery is where this reckoning feels most real. Stand in that small clearing as the light fades. Listen to the wind in the trees. Read the names that have been recovered. Picture the hundreds more whose names are gone. These were the people who built the stairs you climbed, who planted the fields you look over, who cooked the meals that once appeared in the elegant dining room. They made Mount Vernon possible. They deserved freedom. They deserved recognition. They deserved to have their stories told alongside the story of the man who claimed ownership over their lives. History is not meant to be comfortable. It is not a theme park built to reassure us. The past holds beauty and brutality in the same places, often in the same people. Mount Vernon shows this more clearly than almost any other site in America. If you ever visit, walk the grounds with your eyes open. See the mansion and the slave quarters. Spend time in the cemetery. Read about Washington and about Hercules, Ona Judge, Caroline Branham, William Lee, and so many others whose names we are still recovering. Let the contradictions stay unresolved for a while, instead of rushing to tidy them up. That is what it means to care about history honestly. Not to worship heroes or flatten villains, but to see human beings in their full complexity, shaped by their time, yet still responsible for the choices they made. The Potomac keeps flowing, the mansion keeps standing, and the dead keep waiting. Not just to be remembered, but to be remembered clearly.